Wow. My name is Cal Reed, and I don't quite have the biblical knowledge and practical experience of being a minister quite the way David does, but before I get over being nervous and start getting into being emotional, I may as well say this, that I'll start with the dessert. Austin Graduate School of Theology has been part of a strategy by God to literally save my life. Spiritually, my marriage, my physical well-being. So I just want to get that out first and go in a happy place. Basically, I grew up in New York City in a household full of atheists. As a young child, I had some sense that there was a divine being, but it wasn't encouraged in any way, shape, or form. And God always seemed to be toying with me as I was moving along with life. Whether I made good decisions by accident or I felt nudged by some sense of morality to go in a direction when other people were making poor choices, I just felt God's presence was always on me. And so my professional life ended up turning into 17 years in law enforcement. To my parents' political and liberal chagrin, I ended up becoming the worst possible thing that I could have ever ended up being, which was a war profiteer. I was a military contractor. I worked for Blackwater in Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordan. I have done some work in Haiti for our government. And along the way, the way I first came to Christ fully and totally and completely was I met my wife, Ellen. And she set a new standard for dating, which had never been presented to me before. And I was instantaneously attracted to that. And needless to say, her strategy worked and kept me long enough so that we could get married and have 3 beautiful kids. But she led me to Christ. God used her to finally break me apart. And the church that we were married and I was baptized in had a massive church split. And so we went on probably a 15-year journey of going from one church and one faith tradition to another. Mostly Midwestern evangelical, but I've sat in Baptist services, I've sat in Catholic services, I've sat in Methodist services, I've sat in First Churches of Christ, I've sat in, you name it, Agape, First Agapic Church of Christ was another one. Just about every evangelical faith tradition and non-evangelical faith tradition you can think of, except Church of Christ. None of those faith traditions were enough to overcome or educate me out of the cynicism that I felt as a result of experiencing that first church split. And it got so bad, actually, my wife and I got so good at identifying when a church was getting ready to split, we were out of there before it actually happened. I mean, we could see the writing on the wall a mile away, and it usually centered around growth or centered around, a relationship, an unsavory relationship. We became very cynical and very hardened. Well, then God used law enforcement. He used human tragedy and suffering. He used my experiences overseas to continue to lean on him even when church was failing. Not proud to say it, but I have seen all kinds of human brokenness. Some cases I've facilitated it. But along the way I managed to cling to God. I had to. I was not a guy that very easily because of that. And so we come back around to Austin Graduate School of Theology. When I decided to stop going overseas, and I decided that it was more important for me to start putting my life back together with my family, through our pastor at Marble Falls Church of Christ, Greg Neal, I met Dr. Reed, And all of a sudden, it popped on my radar that I need to be going to school. I had been evangelizing. I had been sharing the gospel while I was overseas. I had already been organizing Bible studies with guys that I worked with, guys who also facilitated human brokenness in many ways, shapes, or form. These guys were in dire need of spiritual fulfillment and reconciliation with themselves and with God. And I had to respond to that in what feeble way I knew how. So what I found out was after I came home, I had been neglected. And so without really working, because I was just kind of trying to figure out what life meant after 5 years, decided to start coming to school. The decision was easy. And I found out almost immediately that Austin Graduate School was going to be part of the healing process. One of the things I had lost track of, even though I was saved, even though I had been baptized, was the big why. Why do we worship God? Why do we love Him? What is the point? And like David pointed out, it's easy to pass on information. It's easy to tell people what they need to know about God, but it's easy also to lose sight of that soul connection. And I personally, I believe that that's what so many of our churches are suffering from today. I think it's one reason why God is becoming increasingly irrelevant in the United States, is because we're losing sight of the why. We're losing sight of the meaning. So my first class was with Jim Reynolds. And I'm going to just briefly kind of go down a list of things that I've already picked up on while I'm here. And that's kind of helped put me back together, put my family back together, and certainly made more sense of life with my children. With Jim Reynolds, I learned that the church can be part of intelligent solutions to dealing and handling the marginalized in our society. You know, I was conditioned through my upbringing to believe that Christians were unintelligent, were provincial, narrow-minded, reactionary, will reject. And I had had some experiences to support that. But that didn't diminish my responsibility. So to Dr. Reynolds, I appreciate that. Also, the distinction between cheap grace and versus legalism. That was an interesting thing I picked up on. Dr. Reed, we're still working on this, but the difference between psychologically naked and being transparent. As you can see what side of the argument I'm on. But he's also one of the most, I think one of the most amazing things that I've seen from you was at the men's retreat that you did for us, where you were talking about scenarios where ministers, pastors failed to do their job because they were so entrenched in orthodoxy that they failed to recognize a God moment when it was presented right in front of them. So those types of scenarios, that sharing that experience is going to be invaluable to me as I carry on. Dr. Napier, I learned from you that sin is exerting personal powers given to us by God, but apart from God. We all know that sometimes hearing things in different ways really affects us more than, again, just being given information. So I appreciate that. Dr. Stanglin, I don't know, did Constantine do the right thing or not? But indeed, God is sovereign, so. Dr. Peterson, you are a constant reminder that there are people in this world who have forgotten more about the Bible and Scripture than some of us will ever know. And just amazing to see somebody who's totally dedicated their lives perhaps every fiber of their being to something other than themselves and dedicated to Scripture and God. And Professor Hall, where are you? Oh yeah, there you are. Guys, I tell you to be careful in asking him to treat your papers with the intellectual honesty and rigor as somebody who is writing a doctorate dissertation. But it's appreciated. So, Jim, Stan, Dan, Keith, Jeff, and Todd, thank you. So the positive experiences in the educational process, I think they're fairly self-evident from what I've described. Again, a strategy to put my life back together. And how do I hope to use this education in kingdom living? Because grace is a hard thing for me to really wrap my mind around. Performance-based existence is pretty much where I've lived most of my life. I really hope that I can explain God's mercy and how merciful He is. That's another way I think of attacking a larger problem. We hit hard times in our lives. I ask the question, God, why? I do that a lot. I'm a why person. But if I recognize and I take time to consider how merciful He actually is, that why question becomes far less important, and getting on with living becomes much more attractive. Another way I plan on using to break the bondage of being isolated. I've come to the conclusion, whether being isolated physically or mentally or emotionally, isolation is the devil's playground. And so when we get away from community and genuine, authentic, emoting with one another and really getting beyond ourselves, we can really make connections with people that are marginalized and that don't understand God's grace and don't understand the gospel and why it's so important, that we use our createdness to get in alignment with God's will. And then the last aspect is to address createdness. This humanistic world that we're living in, this continual self-reliance on God's powers that He's bestowed upon us is, I think, breaking our society apart at a moral fabric level. And the one thing that I kept sensing as a kid as I was being raised in this atheist, humanist household was that there had to be more. There had to be a bigger point to my existence than just, and direct quote, being worm food and being buried and dying, as my parents would say. So those are my 3 goals, and I hope to carry them out. I don't know if I'll end up in a professional pastoral role. I like the idea of that interpersonal connection of one-on-one. One of the things that I'd like to do as soon as I think God gives me the green light on this is to really start going into people's homes and encouraging them to come out of their homes and join a bigger community of believers, but basically preaching the gospel in people's homes and challenging them to connect. So.